training, which is, oh, thank you, team. Love it. Yes. So first, we are recording the session. So no worries if you're feverishly taking notes. We will be recording this so you can listen in later. We appreciate you joining us this morning for the training, RDS training and updates. This is part of the Education Professionals Month. We hope you'll find this session beneficial. We have one on the Better FAFSA on Thursday and more to come next week. So we'll share a little bit about that at the end. I'm your host, Kathy Hastings McDonald. I am the Director of Outreach and Communications for the North Carolina State Education Assistance Authority. And for those of you who are not familiar with NCSEAA, we're the state agency that helps North Carolina students plan and pay for their education. We are so pleased to bring you the CFNC.org website and all of the services, all the reps that so many of you connect with in your communities each and every day. And it's a wealth of resource, a wealth of information and tools and strategies and resources that you can share with your students so that they feel more prepared in planning, applying, and paying for college. So we're glad you're here. First, a few housekeeping items. We welcome your questions. So please go ahead and use the chat to let us know what's on your mind and where you feel like you need more help. We always encourage you to share what you're learning on social media. Please use the hashtag CFNC so we can make sure we find you. We love to learn what's resonating with you. And we also always want to help others learn along with us. So share what you're learning there too. As I said, we are going to be recording this session. We'll have it both on the CFNC YouTube channel as well as the education professionals of the CFNC website. I also love to hear where you all are calling in from. So let us know who's in the room with us today and what part of the state you're joining us from. And with that, I know we have a lot to cover today, so I am super excited to welcome Gene Ritter, who is the Residency Program Manager with SEAA. He's my go-to expert on all questions RDS. And so with that, Gene, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I am going to stop sharing.
Thank you. Good morning, all. For some of you, maybe some of this may be review. There's always some new things. I'll talk about any recent changes, but also we're really trying to gear this toward your particular population, working with students in high school, and things we're seeing at our end, things we're hearing from your end, and kind of the stumbling blocks. We're going to look at what are the most common issues students have. A lot of them are avoidable. It's probably student error or oversight, and give you some tips to help students through. We're going to have plenty of time for questions, particularly at the end. So let me share my screen here and let's see. Okay. So a lot of overview material, but again, this is going to be recorded. We'll give you access. So hopefully there. So again, my name is Gene Ritter, a program manager at SEA. I'm going to talk about a little bit about roles in a little bit here. But today we're going to look at, again, what are the roles, SEA, RDS, the college campus, what are they responsible for? I want to review the basic legal requirements because that's, I think, kind of key. A lot of times we have situations where even the RDS staff looking at appeals saying, okay, what do we got to do here? So go back to the basic requirements. And then it's like, are the basic things met? And then how do we substantiate that? Going to talk about the student's experience and options for them. A lot of times they have options to go back and get more information and don't realize it. And then I'm going to focus a lot on common issues we're seeing, helpful tips, the most common things that bring a student back. Most of them are preventable. And then talk about the options for a student who initially gets an out-of-state determination and why that usually happens. And then, there's a appeal process and so forth, but also there are some tuition exceptions that can be given at campus levels. I want to make sure you're aware of for students who just can't meet the legal criteria. And again, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because some of you I know is kind of review, but hopefully some of the tips may be new or give you a different insight for working with high school students. So RDS is a program with CFI, who's one of our partners, nonprofit that helps us with so many of the administration of a lot of programs, including the 529 savings, a lot of the state grants and so forth. And that includes the RDS system of operationalizing that. I'm with the North Carolina State Assistance Authority, Education Authority. We are actually a affiliate agency or a branch of the UNC system, and we focus on helping students get access to, college and universities and so forth. So, and then you're seeing CFNC, if you're not familiar with the difference, all that, that's really a collaboration under our umbrella of partners with CFI, but also community colleges, UNC system, private independent, and public K through 12. So these are the players together. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's SEA that has final authority about the policies, procedures, and final appeals for students pertaining to RDS. So a lot of people don't know, but really the requirements for residency for tuition purposes haven't really changed much since the 1970s. RDS is newer on the scene. They used to be handled at a campus level. The legislature decided a number of years ago to change that based on some of their direct experience as parents, but also a lot of complaints. There was inconsistencies between campuses. Some were more thorough. Some would send you a 25, 30-page book and require you to submit documents. Someone would just ask you a couple questions. It's used for both residency for in-state tuition and state grants. They decided it was better to centralize this and things verified electronically whenever possible to eliminate all this sending of documents, but for consistency. A lot of this, if you've been around for a number of years, was invisible to most high school counselors because the campus handled it as part of admission once they sent them admission information. And so it went directly to the student. Here, they're having them do it up front because many campuses also use this as deciding for, especially competitive schools, about if they're in a in-state pile for admission or out-of-state pile. The state has, in some ways, this is really not that different from the requirements in other states to get a subsidized in-state rate. There's a couple of things that might be a little more stringent. The legislature several times has been asked to, change things and whatnot thus far, including this year. They haven't been willing to go there. And part of that is a lot of people don't realize that we have one of the lowest tuition rates in the country. Especially the community colleges. I didn't check it again this fall, but usually we're the second or third lowest in the entire country. We have more community colleges in our state than most larger states like Texas. So, I mean, the idea is to make this accessible. So and likewise, state dollars for grants are to go by law to residents, and there's competition for that. So the legislator heard complaints from parents about, people are giving a fake address and whatnot. They shouldn't have qualified, and then money ran out before we did. So that's kind of the history of how this evolved. But the students have then one time they go through, and it's used if they apply to multiple colleges, universities. That number is used across the board. The requirements are in statute, and they can't be waived. There's some provisions and exceptions in special cases that we'll go through to try to make this accessible to students, but the law is the law, really, that we have to try to look at and screening. There are a lot of opportunities, especially for special tuition, but the basic law has been in place for years. Okay, hold on here, what's happening? Okay, so the basic legal requirements are, first of all, the individual has to have the legal capacity to establish a permanent residence. That is, you're of legal age, generally, with a couple of exceptions we'll look at. So you must meet the age of majority, but also you have to have a legal ability to establish a permanent residence. That is, a U.S. citizen or hold an immigration status that allows you to establish. A lot of them may have a status that allows them to be temporarily present while their decision is being made about their status. We go by the federal definition of immigration. Does it allow you to establish a permanent residence? Then it has to be a domicile. It has to be your primary permanent residence. I know people that have a secondary home here up in the mountains or at the beach, and families sometimes try to use that when they have a family member trying to come to school in North Carolina. It has to be your, and you must make changes. If you moved here from out of state, you got to show it's a primary, and you've moved here and you've changed your documents to North Carolina. And then duration is, you must, once you establish it, hold it for at least 12 months. And that's pretty similar in just about every state. There's a couple of actually, I think, that are 3 years. So you must have all of those. And finally, there's one other key thing that really is relevant for your students. Law says that it's presumed that the student is domiciled wherever their parent or legal guardian is, until such time they can show that they have their own separate one, which means they have to have the ability, like be 18, to begin to establish, and must be independent, including financial. Okay. Again, the system's used by everybody. We get a lot of students who live in another state. They're not a resident. They know that, but they want to come here to go to school. But after 12 months of being here, their first year of university, they want to get in state saying, I've been here for a year. Okay, but they're not independent. They've been living in a dorm. That's not a permanent change. The key thing here I'm going to come back to is, from our definition, the student doesn't have to be living with the parent. So when they say, I don't live with my parent, I live with someone else, there's provisions for that. We can look at that. There's also a lot of provisions there that RDS screens for, and these are some of them. Again, if they're a non-citizen, do they have an eligible status? Are they awarded the state in foster care? Were they emancipated from their parents by marriage or quarter at age 16 or 17? Were they orphaned with no, and so forth? There's a lot in here. For a lot of students, that living long-term with an adult relative, one or more, as long as that adult relative. So the person says, I've been living with my grandmother since I'm 10. Okay, we just need at that point to document the years and that the relative is truly a North Carolina resident. So there's a lot of special scenarios that as the students going through the process, these are all covered in the interview if they answer them. What's not going to help is if they try to list someone as a parent who isn't their parent. That's going to at some point get bounced. So it's better to know the details up front. Again, the immigration status, there's two types we look at. If it's permanent, we check a box in the system like the green card holder, and even though the card may expire for reasons of combating fraud, it's permanent, so they'll never have to present it again. If it's temporary, some of them have to be tracked. Some of the students long-term are here on something, an umbrella under their parent, and they may lose eligibility at a certain age. So they might have a change in status unless they can qualify for something of their own. And then finally, if they don't present us a document or it's not an eligible status, we don't put details in the system. We try to respect the privacy of the family, and just say they didn't present evidence. So it doesn't necessarily, they could have a status and just didn't send, that's eligible, didn't send the document. They could have a status that's not eligible. They might not have any status. We don't record that. So the general categories are here. You can look in the RDS guidebook for details, but these are the ones that are the general categories that will permit. There's certain non-immigrant visas. There's a long list, and it's much longer than, like, if you're familiar with FAFSA, the first three categories are acceptable for Pell, financial aid, federally, but only like 2 visa types. We have dozens that would permit them to get in-state tuition. Some of these change. The list of visas and that temporary protected status is very complex, and we have to look up each one because it changes literally monthly of who's eligible. So RDS takes care of all that. You don't need to worry about it. The student answers the question, and then it prompts them what kind of documents, and it sometimes gives a choice. Do you have this or this? You could show us. I want to caution you about the term refugee here. We're using the official classification by U.S. Immigration. There's a refugee category. The popular press uses this and a lot of other terms that are understood in different ways, that often do that to say anybody who's arrived in this country wanting to stay. It's a very specific category. So the other big thing that RDS screens for, I mentioned that the basic laws haven't changed much. I think it was 1984, there was a federal law that North Carolina adopted to provide a kind of a blanket situation for active duty military. Active duty military members can declare to the military what state they want to give as their permanent residence, so they don't have to keep changing every time they get transferred. If we have someone who comes to North Carolina and is stationed here, but is claiming another state, as long as they show they get stationed here, they and any family or dependent who's with them can get in-state tuition blanket. There's no other restriction. In terms of qualification. When we get to veterans later, they have to use a benefit, and the VA has to pay for it. But in this case, it's kind of a blanket. So again, RDS screens for all of this. So when they go through the questions in the interview, that's how we catch these things. And we would give them that tuition exception that the campus would see and automatically grant. Okay, so I'm going to talk just briefly about the student's experience and point out a couple of helpful hints there. If you're not familiar with it, it utilizes an online system, kind of like a tax prep program, like TurboTax, TaxAct, and people say, can you give us a list of questions? Every student's going to see a different number and different order, depending on their situation. For example, the first one is, do you want to claim to be a resident for tuition purposes? If they say no, someone from another state or someone who just got here, they know they're not going to meet it. They could say no, they've got their number to apply to a college, they're done. And it tells them you can always come back later if you think you've had a change. Most students, 99% plus, get a provisional decision immediately based on what they're telling us, subject to validation. The student who says yes to a whole long, something of the above apply to a whole long list of questions that are meant to pick up for things like homelessness or some of the McKinney-Vento qualifiers, trying to detect, do they not have a stable living environment? Do they kind of get bounced around? Are they couch surfing, live in their car, so forth? If they say yes to any of them, then we collect information, but it tells them, we're not going to give you one right now. We're going to review what you've given us to see if we can find enough information to validate you. If not, we'll be in touch as to what, you might be able to submit. Part of the problem we have is we hear people call and say, oh, this is, a student, whatever, but they didn't say yes to that question. They said no, or they're trying to use another relative or something, and it gets bounced. If they said yes to that, we would know up front and try to work with the student to understand their situation. The four-year institutions will not pull these decisions in that are provisional. They wait for it to be validated, but this was done to accommodate community colleges because they'll let someone show up as classes are starting and just apply and register and come right in. So it helps them get registered. The RDS determination should be part of what I'll come back to, but very importantly, please don't have the students fill this out in their junior year. Colleges and universities are begging that I remind everyone that they expire before the student gets there. If the student fills this out, say this October, it's good the following fall, but also if they defer, let's say into spring, it gives them an academic year. After that, legally, the attorneys say we've got to test again because, a lot of times families move when there's a high school graduate, move out of state, and then it causes problems for some of them that have strict quotas, like the UNCs that have so many by law they can only have from out of state. If all of a sudden they show up in class and say, oh, by the way, my family moved. So it's going to expire. So please don't have them do it before then. Or if they do, come back and get a renewed one. It's the campus's decision of whether they require this upfront, the RDS number, when they submit an application, or if they could do it later on. All of the community colleges require upfront. Most of the UNCs do. I would encourage you to have them do it up front because almost all the UNC institutions will use the RDS determination up front as their screening for admission to decide whether they go in the in-state pile or out of state. And as I mentioned, the UNCs, particularly the competitive ones, it's very tough if you're out of state because they have a very strict quota by law. So it's better to do it up front as possible. And that way too, if there's any issues, the student needs to come back, they have time to do that. Once a student has a determination from RDS, as long as they enroll by that expiration date and they remain continuously enrolled, they're good to go. They don't need to come back to RDS again. So first they go through, we call it an initial consideration, and they complete that interview and they get their RCN, the residency certification number. Each student has a unique number. They keep it for life. So if a student, let's say, goes to community college, decides taking a couple of years off to work, and then later comes back to go to university or later comes back for graduate school, they keep the same account. If there's a big gap in there, they have to go through it again, but they keep the same number, and we have stuff on file. And a lot of times when we see that, we don't need to ask for certain things again. We try to, whenever possible, almost all our information is validated electronically with state agencies. So if they say, yes, I or my parents have a driver's license, vehicle registration, voter registration, we're working in North Carolina, we pay state taxes, we're registered to vote. That's all pinged electronically and we get back yes or no. Only about 5%. And I went and we looked at October, the last 2 years of students in the IC were asked for a document. And there's things that we can't verify electronically. Now, later on, many may have to because they're contesting it or saying state databases are wrong or something. They always have the opportunity to submit more information. But most students are passing behind the scenes if there's no document and it's electronically validated. So the documents are usually up front about immigration, court orders, or military service. Everything else is done electronically. So again, later they can, on a reconsideration appeal, they're welcome to submit more, saying, oh, it's wrong, you know, which is possible. So, but unusual, but possible. So what type of information? We have a lot of resources on our website, the public website, ncresidency.org, and all this is later in contact information if you're not familiar with it, but this is a very useful one for y'all. It shows you what type of information would be needed when they're filling out FAFSA and what they would need for RDS. And you see they're pretty similar. So it's a way to help students prepare what to bring when they're completing these processes. There's a lot of other information on the website of resources, students in particular situation, you know, about immigration issues or you know, what if they've lived with you know, relative long-term, things like that. This is important because a lot of students say, well, I don't know what's next, or I don't know what to do, or I don't agree with it. What do I do? They can always log back into their account and they see a dashboard. Like, here's an example. I know you can't read some of this, it's kind of small, but you know, were you a resident for tuition purposes? Yes. Okay. Are you getting state tuition? Yes. Well, if they're military, for example, with the exception, it would say, no, you're not considered a resident. You might not get a state grant, but yes, you're eligible for this tuition. Has it been validated yet? No. Validation typically happens like in a business day electronically, unless there's a document. We have to wait till we get the document. If they owed a document, there'd be another box, and what you see in blue, there'd be a text box in red saying, we have not received your whatever document, your immigration document, your military orders, whatever. Students also, as I say, they can check their status at any time, but also there's a button for if they feel it's wrong or need to give more information or want it reviewed for reconsideration appeal, and it walks them through that process. So they can always log in and see what's going on there. So options are a reconsideration appeal, you know, if they feel it's wrong or there's more information or there's, you know, it's an unusual situation. And that when they click that button, it walks them through the difference. The reconsideration is more if you didn't submit something on time or you have more information, they skipped all the questions, they can provide more information. It's better they go through that because it might happen automatically. The appeal basically tells them it's like, it's really so unique, or it doesn't put them through the whole interview. They have to type a narrative, a brief one about what's going on in the situation. And it's assigned to a worker who works with them one-on-one. If it's just, oh, I forgot to submit a document, it would be faster to do the other. And it walks them through that difference. If it's really an unusual situation, probably the appeal. They're assigned to a worker one-on-one they can always talk to, who then reviews it with a committee. We're going to talk a little bit about, in some cases, if a student doesn't get in state, there may be some campus-based tuition exceptions. Some are very time limited, some are very restricted. They're defined in law. We're going to quickly look at some of them later. And then finally, if they feel the RDS appeal was incorrect and can cite, you know, in the guidebook and whatnot, the reasons, they can come to SEAA, the state level. We don't get many, and most of them are, they don't agree with the, you know, the law, basically, and there's not much we can do about that. I mean, it's almost always. A lot of them are students who came here to go to college, and after a year they want to be in, but they have no financial means, you know, the parents are paying the bill, so they see it as, but I've lived here for a year. So, okay, this is a very valuable slide. I've gone back the last couple of years and looked at students who got out of state. What were the reasons? And the top four, before you hit that line, are the most common, rank ordered. The number one by far is they're keying in wrong social or date of birth, so things are not validating. We set up something early on where they have to key it in twice and it has to match. So that means they've keyed it in wrong, identically the same, twice. This is by far the number one reason students get out of state. These 4 top reasons constitute like 85% of the reconsiderations coming back. Or they fill out their name and address and certain things about, oh, well, that's enough, and they just skip all the questions. So if you say no, me or my family members don't have any of the above, license, vehicle, employment, taxes, voter. We also ask the HHS programs like Medicaid, food stamps. We don't have anything. Well, we have to assume you just moved here. You don't have anything. So skipping too many questions is next, or keying in other incorrect information. And then finally, student is saying, I want to be considered independent, but they don't have any income, or they're under 18 and don't qualify for a legal exception. And they're given a chance. Then it says, it doesn't look like you're going to pass. Do you want to provide parent guardian information? If they say no, then they'll probably be out, and they'd have to come back and give us some reason why, and then followed by a smaller percent of people who just moved here. They haven't been here 12 months. And by the way, that has been something particularly the UNCs have been concerned about historically, because we do get people where they will either come here or more commonly send someone for their senior year of high school to live with a relative here, just for hopes of a better chance of getting admitted to one of the more competitive schools. So, but anyway, the 12 months applies no matter what. You have to have lived here for 12 months. Or we requested documents, they didn't do it, or they don't hold an eligible immigration status that the law permits them to be considered a resident. This, when I hear about, well, we have students with this, that, or the orphan, whatnot, that is truly the rare exception. And most of them, there are provisions had they answered it as they went through and told us up front the situation. When they do a reconsideration appeal, there's a chance to type a little explanation. That's very helpful if they put something. Most of them leave it blank. But this constitutes probably 98, 99% of people coming back. The others are less common. So based on all that and what we're seeing, and with the team that processes these Cs, here's some tips we have for you. Again, please don't have them complete it prior to their senior year. It's going to expire, and it just, then there's issues with them getting an out-of-state bill and whatnot. And what do you mean? I did it before. Stress how carefully they've got to enter that information, because a lot of times they come back and, when they enter it correctly or more completely, it's helpful. Provide as much parent information as possible, not other adults. So they say, I don't live with my parents, or, we don't get along. If most cases, they're going to know their name and address and maybe date of birth. Whatever they happen to know a social, that's golden. We can look up things, but at least that, not 100% of the time, but a lot of times we can do database lookups to find that. We've had students say, my parents incarcerated. Okay, if you tell us that, and we can look up at a database that they were from here, and they're, when they became incarcerated, student's good to go. But we've got to legally look at the parent unless it's a legal provision where you don't have to. Again, they don't have to be living with the parent, but as much information as possible. They've got to be a U.S. citizen, the student does, or hold an eligible status. We don't look at citizenship or immigration status of a parent. We do not look at that. Don't need to know that. We just need evidence that the parent is residing here. And there's many ways we can look at that. If a student's having a problem passing, again, go to reconsideration or appeal. And again, most scenarios are built in. All those things I mentioned about my parents are deceased, I'm orphaned, or a war of the state or whatnot. Those questions are built in. The student just needs to say yes to them. Or a lot of those situations trying to look at potential homelessness and whatnot, those qualifiers from McKinney-Vento and other things are built in. But unfortunately, most of them don't say, yes, one of those applies to me. Generally, a student who's 18 even is not going to be able to qualify if the parent's out of state. That to begin to establish residency, they wouldn't have the legal ability to begin to 18. So that means they have to wait a year. It's probably 19 before they can be truly independent, with rare exceptions. When you have these unusual things, don't try to second guess, but contact the call center or send them to an appeal where someone reviews it. We get a lot of times people, trying to help the student and send in all kinds of documents and Like, I know for like, if you're trying to help with a student with a dependency override for FAFSA for college McKinney-Vento folks, we get these letters of support. Can you please give them in state? Legally, that there's nothing we can do with that. Or if the student owes us, for example, an immigration document, sending us 20 other documents showing their address isn't going to help. Or we have 6 sources saying they've lived here, but they're all in the last month or two, and we need one thing showing 12 months. So I'd say usually wait for RDS to review it, and they're going to tell you exactly what we need. More is not always better. Most of the times when people just try to send everything, it doesn't always answer the question. Again, if they come back for reconciliation appeal, the student can make a brief statement. A lot of them don't. It's like, because I live here, you know, what's the situation, you know, or there are details you want to provide us because I live here. And that's where it's like, I've been living with my grandmother, you know, my parents incarcerated, I'm orphaned. Right then we know what to do. Okay. McKinney-Vento designation. There's a misunderstanding that there's a blanket exception in federal law for students in secondary ed. There is not. So we look at that to understand the situation, but we have to find a way to qualify them. Because they're not living with the parent does not exempt them from the state law about we have to look at the parent as a strong consideration unless we find another path. There are other paths. We just need to know the situation. I talked about this about other documents. So the student continues to get out of state. They can't meet the legal requirements. What other options are there? Well, first of all, veterans and their families, there may be an option that if they don't meet the legal requirements, much of the time the service member will assign an educational benefit to a student. The campus can review that, and if there's an award there, they'll get adjusted to in-state. But it's contingent on an award that's been assigned and usable, so the campus has to handle that one. Likewise, there are some campus-based tuition exceptions, okay? These never grant residency, so they won't get a state grant, which requires they fully meet the criteria, but there are very specific exceptions in law. The student at that point, first try the RDS. If that doesn't work, let them work with the individual campus, because some of these, it's at their discretion. Some of them have legal caps, some of them they don't have to give. UNCA will tell you it's very hard. They only have 2 scenarios. If you're an 100% full scholarship, or if you and an immediate family member are a regular full-time employee, they'll give you 1 year of duration. Community colleges have a much longer list, and they go through that. So community colleges have been successful in getting some legislative exceptions. A lot of these are very restricted with a lot of details, and it's at the discretion of the campus. Sometimes some of them, for example, it can't exceed 1% of all of their out-of-state students and things like that. But have them work with it. The first one, business sponsored, is if a North Carolina business is saying, I have an employee I want to send to school and we pay 100% directly to the college, there's an exception there, as long as that employer pays 100% directly. This, by the way, is one of only 2 scenarios I know of that might apply to someone, you know, designated as DACA or doesn't have an immigration status. It's not required. The others have some immigration requirements. A business transferred family, you know, they'll give them a year in some cases. Students sponsored by a nonprofit, they have to be resident, but again, it gives them that 1 year. Recent arrivals. There's a couple that would be the high school graduates, public high school graduates, the non-citizen must show that they were lawfully admitted. So maybe they don't have a current eligible status, but they were lawfully admitted. There may be an exception there. Likewise, a non-citizen, I'm sorry, a citizen, the bottom of the one should say, I left the one off for citizen. There's one for citizens that will give them 1 year after high school graduation. So the student who truly has no contact with the parents or moved here or something, they might get a year and they're supposed to be establishing on their own merit. Likewise, some of these get into very complicated immigration issues. Campuses usually work for me, but they have very specific requirements. But if they're going to community college, there may be more options for a tuition exception for a year. Excuse me. The RDS guidebook is the official document we use, and it walks through all these scenarios, all the legal requirements. They're all cross-referenced with state and federal law. It's available on our public website. I'm getting ready to release a new one soon. I'm just waiting for one last bill in the legislature to see what needs to get included. But it's all public information about what the legal requirements are and what we follow. So they can look that up. And if you want more detail, like about the campus things or about which immigration visas, it's all in that document online. The other resources, if you're not familiar, is again, the public website. There's a lot of great one-page information for counselors, for parents, for students, especially in certain situations. There's that call center helpline. The student can either online or verbally ask for a third party to discuss this detail with you or someone else. During peak season, there may be extended hours, but they're there all day, as well as an email. You can email questions about, or they could call, I'm not sure how to answer this question. What are my next steps? That kind of thing. And that's it. That's a lot of information dump, but let me stop there.
Thanks, Gene. Lots of great questions coming through. I'm always thrilled to see engaged audiences really wanting to get their questions answered. So thanks, folks, for sending those in. Feel free to keep sending those over. We'll just start with some of the questions that came through. Nicole is wondering, for students who are North Carolina residents, they're U.S. citizens with undocumented parents, is there going to be an easier process? I think there's a lot of confusion around this this particular issue. So.
Okay.
I know you mentioned it, but if you wouldn't mind clarifying.
So again, from our perspective, RDS, who cares if they're undocumented? We never look at the documentation status of the parent. I think that's caused people to hesitate. We look at, are they living here? The student can tell us, for example, like when it gets to a question about parent information, the student could say, my parent either doesn't have, for example, a social security number or doesn't wish to share information. Okay. Some parents, everybody could be a U.S. citizen, that's it. Or, they could be living here, not living here. We don't know. We don't care. I mean, what we have to look at is if you're saying they're living here, we just need a way to verify it. Now, if they truly don't have a social, or if they have a tax ID number, a lot of times we can look them up that way. A lot of people who may not have an eligible status have a tax ID number and they're filing state taxes, or they have a vehicle registration, or they have a lease, or they have a utility. So a lot of times in those cases, if the student comes back, we say, what does the parent have? Or we give an or. Can you submit a lease or a utility bill or a this or a that? Sometimes we combine that with a high school transcript showing the name and address. So it depends on what we need. Sometimes we'll get two things, but they're all this month. Well, we need something from a year ago. And that's where it's better to handle it case by case. But we still have a legal obligation to show that the parent is living here. That can be done in many ways. If it can't, some of them pass automatically if they have some of those things, like a vehicle registered, or they're paying state taxes. If they don't, that's where on a reconsideration appeal, say my parents, don't have or don't wish to share some information, and then wait, and then RDS will say, okay, we need one showing 12 months, or we need this, and they usually give them or. So the ones that, when we validate electronically, a lot of agencies require name and date of birth. Some of them require a social. So if they don't have a social, it just means we might have to get a document.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Appreciate that clarification. Alice is saying, I would love to know what % of appeals and or reconsiderations are the result of students whose parents don't have a social security number and either have no ID or use an ITIN.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if I've run it that way, but I will tell you at the end of the day, I mean, what we have looked at is students who, as I say, I think what's happened is some people are trying to focus in on understanding if the parents have a status or not. And I think that's weighed this down. As I say, we don't consider that is if you say my parent doesn't have a social, but at the end of the day, if we know that, we're asking for a document. So do you have a, you know, as long as they have something, and we have at least two, so you have a high school transcript with that or whatnot. But again, I wouldn't just send stuff, because sometimes we'll have something we'll have 3 documents, but they're all this month, and we don't have something showing a year. And then we work with them with an email or call saying, can you give us this, that? But to answer your question, I will say that at the end of the day, when someone ends an appeal, that is almost never a final reason for not passing. If they can show they're truly here, and it's the parent, that they're not living with, you know, a relative or friend of the family and just got here a year ago. And whether the parent's documented or not documented, just doesn't want to share it, or lives in another country or another state, I mean, we just need to verify that they're living here.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks. Nikisha's wondering, what's the process if a student receives in-state status, then receives something stating that their status changed to out of state? Both parent and student have been in North Carolina for 7 years and are both citizens. I'm assuming that's an appeals situation.
I would review the information. They can see the information they set, and is it based on keying in the wrong? I bet you anything they keyed in wrong information, if that's really the case. That's the number one reason that, so that's why I tell you early on, the universities didn't like that idea of sharing that provisional unvalidated, because students said, well, you said I was in state yesterday, even though it tells them this is subject to validation. That was done to accommodate last minute students at the community colleges. The UNCs won't even pull them in because there can be a change. And as I say, 85% of the time, that's the number one reason is stuff was keyed in wrong. And we get that. I've been here my whole life. How dare you put me in a state? Well, you gave us a different date of birth, and people will be surprised. I mean, we have something like 2.4 million students in the database at this point. And when they give me a name, I might have 12 students with the same exact name and even same year of birth. So, you know, we got to be exact in this. Yeah.
Sure. And we see the same thing with FAFSA. The number one challenges with FAFSA is people keying in wrong information. So we see it there as well. Okay, John is asking, a parent refuses to give social security number, which puts a student as out of state automatically. Is there a way for the student to be reconsidered as in-state if parent refuses to give social security number?
Again, legally, we have to find a way to validate. And that's why if the student, you know, and again, it's happened, but then, yeah, that might take an appeal, but then explain, what do you know about the parent? And if they could say, my parent doesn't, you know, again, on the reconsideration appeal, put in a statement, my parent doesn't wish to share this, or, you know, what you can share, what you do have, because a lot of students just try to bypass information entirely. And when they're 18, they're probably not going to pass. So put in there, okay, because more often than not, when they come in appeal, they know where this parent lives, often can give us a date of birth. And if possible, sometimes we have access to a lot of databases, employment and whatnot. If we can look up and see that they're living in North Carolina, we'll pass them. So it might take physical intervention if we don't have anything to go on, but the more information they can provide makes it more likely it'll go faster.
Right. And countering, I just want to make sure we're countering with something you said earlier, because I know you mentioned that sometimes people send tons of stuff in that may or may not be needed. So it's providing information when you're asked, and ideally the specific things that are being requested.
Right. The more RDS knows about what the specific situation is, we know better what to ask for. But as again, a common thing is like, if we might have 6 things showing, yeah, the family's here, they're all dated this month. We need at least one showing where they here a year ago to meet the requirement. So sending us 10 more saying, well, I sent you 15 documents, doesn't meet that thing. Or about immigration status. If we've asked for it and you don't submit it, or I'm military here in orders, until we verify that piece, sending 20 other things to answer other questions won't help.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you, sir. Okay, Alice is asking if a student gets an eligible immigration status, such as a green card finally arriving or asylum is granted, do they have to start their 12-month residency at that time, or can their previous time in state be counted?
That depends. It depends on what status they had before. Sometimes they move from one status to another, which is okay. If the family member had, we normally don't ask about family, but if we see that it looks like the student recently arrived, it's happened that part of the family was here, like a parent was here and brought the rest of the family here, and the student recently arrived already approved for a status. We ask that if they want us to consider, if the parent had one for at least 12 months, we might be able to piggyback on that duration. If they choose to share that, that's one of the few cases if they want us to look at it, but the parent had to have had a status prior to that.
Okay.
But again, this is all stuff that I think y'all, this can get very convoluted. Just explain the situation RDS and we'll review it each case. Sometimes people move from one eligible status to another. 99% of the time, you are never going to go directly to a green card. They had a status before, and most of them are going to be eligible, but we need to get information on that. We know what to look for. Sometimes we can tell by the documents they submit. This is probably the most complicated issue we face in RDS is immigration. It's okay. It's so convoluted, but yeah, I mean, we'll look at that and we'll review it. If there's a way to do it, we will do it.
Okay, great. The follow-up question Alice had is on the appeal for students with undocumented parents. I am never sure which button to advise students to select as the reason for the appeal or what they should write in the reason. I don't want them saying my parent is undocumented. So what's your advice?
Well, that's why I strongly recommend we stop asking about parents or stop using that term, because it's scaring parents off. Sometimes they're afraid somebody's going to put that in our system. We feel very strongly about that, as the colleges, universities do. If you have another conversation offline for another reason, but to me, again, it doesn't make any difference whether they are or not. We just need to show they're living here. So what I would just say is, my parents, I'm not sure what to share. There's some information they don't have or don't wish to share, or they don't have a social they wish to share. We don't care whether they have one, they're all US citizens, or and just protecting privacy, or they don't have one. It really makes no difference to us. And so I think we're too focused on that issue.
Well, and we certainly see with FAFSA as well that more and more parents just don't want to share their information, regardless of even if they have a social security number, they have feelings about the government.
Exactly. And so the reason we ask for it is to make sure we're verifying the right people, but some agencies require it. Okay, we know that you don't want to share it. If we know that and know what's going on, we can find ways to work around it. And we could say, okay, in that case, we do need documents. A lot of people would rather share that than not sending documents, for fear of identity theft. Yeah. Okay, well, then we may need some documents here. And there's a way, sometimes we'll work with them one-on-one. We don't get many of those to say, I've got to mask the ID and all that. Okay, but we'll work with them. But again, I think we're too focused on worrying about immigration status of a parent that RDS makes no difference whatsoever.
Yeah. Okay. I think Kanija, I'm sorry if I'm messing up your name. What are the next steps when a student receives out-of-state status because their parents are not US citizens?
Again, I have the same response. I don't know how somehow the conversation has gotten onto those issues. It makes no difference for RDS. It's that whether they're citizens or not, if they don't have certain things, we have to find an alternate way. What we were just talking about, like about
if the social. They live in the state.
Okay, well then we look at, what do you have you're willing to share? Are you willing to share, an ID card? Are you willing to share a pay stub or a lease or employment information, or and so we usually give them an or. And if that doesn't work, then they can call in and we'll find out, or do an appeal, and we can find, we'll ask them, what are your parents willing to share, and see if that can or suggest something. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. So Karen is asking, how about students living with grandparents or parents that are out of the picture?
Mhm.
There may be a legal custody order, so I know that's more straightforward, or it may be an informal arrangement, but the student has been living with grandparents for years.
Right. So the key thing is to communicate that to us. There's a couple scenarios there. Is once there's a court-appointed legal guardian, that would supersede, that they're appointing someone as a guardian, and it's court. It's not just a attorney here. You can take care of my kid. We get that a lot for the people who send their seniors down here to high school. They sign a power of attorney, but the fact that the parents are signing it means the parents still have the legal authority. Okay, it's a temporary arrangement. If the court declares a legal guardian, we can certainly look at that, and there's provisions in there about court-appointed legal guardian. If not, the provisions in law are that if a student has lived at least 5 consecutive years with one or more adult relatives who are residents of North Carolina, that can be considered in lieu of the parent. So again, those are probably ones you have to explain. I've lived with my grandmother for 5 years, or I've lived in North Carolina for 5 years with different relatives. Then we'll work with the student to find out, do we have the correct name, or did you give a parent, they're somewhere else? What's that person's name? Then we'll try to verify that person's a North Carolina resident. But in that case, they don't have to be the court-appointed guardian, nor do they have to be claiming them on taxes or show dependents. There's a de facto guardian clause in law. So again, it's like in most of these cases, when RDS knows the whole picture, we know what to ask for, because there's so many of these special provisions in law. It's really hard to cover all of them for every scenario. But when we know the picture, that's a big suggestion today, is put in a reconsideration appeal exactly what the situation is, and we'll try to find anything we can to qualify the student.
Yeah, great. Okay. Alice is asking for, she's mentioning the final bullet point, which I think was on your last slide before we switched to questions. When you're considering pending application for permanent resident status approved, sorry, I didn't get the
Yeah.
whole thing
Okay.
down. Yeah. So if you can clarify that.
So yes. Again, I mean, these get into really detailed, fine point. In fact, the community colleges, when they come across these, even though they have the right to grant them, I mean, 99% of the time they're on the phone with me because these get so complicated. This would be a rare event, okay? Because what we will do at RDS is if they file a petition that's been approved for green card, for permanent resident status, there's usually a delay before they get their physical card because there's biometrics, they've got to go in for appointments and all that. But if we show a document saying you've been approved, now you can go through the rest of the process, we will approve them based on that. Then we don't have to wait. This is someone who has filed but hasn't had a decision yet. Okay, they filed for permanent resident. Depending on their category, some of them will be approved very quickly if it's an immediate family member of how they're getting one. Other categories, like what they call diversity visa, they grant so many per year. It's like a lottery for certain countries that are not represented here. That could take years for approval. We take it as once it's filed, and you're approved, even though you don't have your card in hand, we're good to go. We can look up that. Community college has an exception to grant them that, or they got a green card approval, but they haven't been here 12 months, they'll give them a year. So again, if it's a campus exception, the campus is going to have to work with them. But anytime, by the way, a student has a change in immigration status, they can always come back to RDS, we'll review it again. But these, see what I mean? These get remarkably complicated, so that even people that deal with it every day, like our appeal folks, are usually on the phone with me. I spend a lot of my effort keeping up on immigration issues as things change. I hope that helps.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I know it's quite complicated. Okay, Jocelyn is asking, would DACA graduated from a North Carolina high school be able to grant a student in-state or an exception? They weren't able to find it in the guidebook.
DACA, there is something in the guidebook about, and I'm going to expand that in eligible status. Likewise, a lot of people arriving, like I hear about, quote, refugees from Ukraine and Afghanistan. they were not, with rare exception, they were not designated as refugees or classified that way. That's the popular media, okay? DACA, again, we have to go by when someone has an immigration designation, what is it defined by the federal government? The federal government says they're here temporarily removed from withholding from the country until we decide what we're going to do. Same thing with people applying for asylum. Legally, they cannot establish a residence. It is unlikely they will meet any of the criteria for exceptions because you had to have been admitted legally. For example, someone who has a visa, they're admitted legally, but it expires and they go into what immigration calls an overstay. They were lawfully admitted, they'll give them an exception for a period of time, hoping that they might get it renewed or something else. DACA, by definition, it's probably unlikely that they ever had one, but if they have evidence, maybe. There's only two scenarios where someone with that status could possibly pay in state tuition, and really the primary one would be that if an employer sends 100% of the payment directly every semester to the college, community college. All those exceptions, by the way, UNCs will not accept. It's just community colleges. That's really the option. Likewise, with people who are here on these humanitarian paroles, like those folks or a lot of other recent arrivals, or people who have applied for asylum, U.S. Immigration said you may not be considered a resident. So we have to go by that legal definition.
Great. Okay, thanks. Holly heard that students will not be able to use the RCN number on applications this year until after they have had this number for 3 days. Is that correct?
That is an institutional decision and probably based on that validation piece.
Okay.
Yeah. Again, it was very controversial about even sharing that unvalidated, but the community colleges really pushed for it because how many last minute students. But I mean, the UNCs and even some of the community colleges don't like taking them because if they keyed in wrong information or it was not accurate information, then they get flipped. And then there's a big, issue. And sometimes they owe a balance if it's late in the term and things like that. So that's an institutional decision if they don't want to pull it in, because it's the institution's decision also. If someone gets a new determination after the start of term, is it effective that term or the next term is an institution decision.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, sir. Rocky's asking a little more clarification around, the language, what to tell students and the language to use when they are appealing related to a parent's immigration status. So if they're kind of, not speaking about immigration status, what is some potential language to use? I know you've spoken a little bit about, what you're trying to get to is have the parents been living in the state and demonstrating that.
I think the key is the biggest issue that helps us electronically is if there's a name, date of birth, and social. So if they don't have a social or don't wish to share it, if they have an ITIN, please put that in because that's very helpful. We might be able to validate them based on that if they file taxes, and many do. But I would just say, again, repeating the question from the interview is like, my parents don't have or don't wish to share Social Security or whatever it is. And then we know, okay, well, now we're going to make this a manual process. And so, we'll assume sensitivity to that issue of, okay, we'll ask for things that are generic enough that if they don't have, they might not have certain things, but they should have something else. They've got to have something showing they're here. Do they have a lease, a utility bill, any employment, a pay stub, something? We'll give them ORs. So that's what I would do, is just reiterate that my parents don't have or don't wish to share certain information such as an SSN. And then we know to ask for something different.
Very good. I think that's it in terms of questions. Is there, so I'm gonna prompt upcoming sessions unless something else comes through in the chat. Folks, we're in the middle of Education Professionals Month, so there is more to come. We will be back on this Thursday from 1 to 2:30 with a better FAFSA. So we'll be sharing all the latest, as we know it today, of the big changes that are coming with FAFSA and tricky situations we know is something that you all work with every day. Next week, we're going to be focusing on Pro Tools. So Tuesday will be an overview and a kind of a walkthrough of the reporting within Pro Tools. Thursday will be a working session. So that's the time to bring any questions you have on Pro Tools or finish the FAFSA to that session, and we're happy to answer it. We appreciate all the folks who have sent in their questions ahead of time so we can kind of gauge what are the key areas you want to make sure we cover. The last week we're going to be covering, on Tuesday, we're going to be covering assisting students that are in special family situations. So that could be things like experiencing homelessness, or they have been experiencing the foster care system as examples, and or, you know, as we've talked today, mixed status families. And then the final session, which I'm excited about, is how to create and foster community involvement with Countdown to College. And your schools partnering together. As you know, there's plenty of people in the community who may have that trusted relationship with the student. And so we want to bring those folks in and have them help us in helping students plan and envision their future. So, okay. I am just checking in with April. I'm not seeing any other questions, but just doing a temperature check with you. If so, we will conclude the session.
I just want to say thank you, everyone. Hopefully this was helpful. We're trying to gear this toward issues we commonly see from high school students and how best to navigate the system. You know, personally, a lot of our staff, myself, may not agree with a lot of these issues, and pretty much every legislative session they try to get them to build in other provisions, especially for like DACA students, and just routinely the legislature has not gone there. And you know, we have to, you know, go with what we have and find any, but if we have anything and we know the situation, we're going to try to find any legal way we can. I mean, really the spirit of the whole thing is to not let people who like we talked about that final level of SCA appeal. It's rare I get anyone that was like just in high school. These years later, they come here. I had one, I think, in the last 2 years where the parent and student, they live in South Carolina and everything points to there, but they come across the border because the parent works here and the student's in a North Carolina high school, but they're claiming South Carolina as their permanent home. So, you know, it is what it is. But I mean, we rarely get them. And I know sometimes it may seem like a hurdle, but we've got to, you know, follow the legal constraints we have. But if we could find a way, you know, if we know the situation, we know what to look for. We'll find a way to try to qualify the student.
Yeah, we have colleges and universities that other folks want to come to, and that's unfortunately why these laws were required. But Alice, we appreciate your feedback in the chat. Totally get that. You all are in doing life-changing work, and I know it can be frustrating at times, and you know, we're all doing our best to you're doing your best and we're doing our best to follow the law. So totally get that. April, passing it on to you.
Thank you. No, I just see one question. Someone's asking if we can, or Jean or someone, if you could share the contact numbers again for folks with questions, either maybe in the chat or just verbally. I know there was a slide that talked about.
Let me go back to.
Thank you. And that's the last thing I think I've seen come through.
Yeah. And, you know, this is a lot, I know, to digest. It really is complicated, especially as with good intent, they've tried to build in all these special provisions for certain situations, like if you're orphan or you've lived long term with a parent or whatnot. This does get very convoluted. And I know that, and, you know, especially if a lot of your students don't have these unique scenarios, pick up the phone, call RDS and ask, you know, at a conference recently, we were talking about something and someone said, well, I've called them with the same question for different students that gotten different answers. Well, you might, when it comes down to tell me what document you always need, because maybe we have, the example I gave was have several things showing they're living here, but nothing with duration. Or we have several things showing, you know, everything else but immigration status, or we don't have that military document. So you might get a different answer. But I mean, the more RDS knows, we can help guide you through it. So don't feel you have to be expert in all these things, especially the convoluted world of immigration.
Thank you, sir. All right, April, I think we're ready to wrap up.
Great. Thank you all so much. We appreciate you coming today, and hopefully we'll see you Thursday when Kathy joins us again to talk a little bit about Better FAFSA. We have some great programs still coming this month, and you will all receive a feedback survey when this program is over. At some point today, you will get it, and we appreciate you completing that. And if you have any questions, let us know. You can go to cfnc.org/C2C and click on schools to see more information about other programs that are happening. So once again, we appreciate your time today, and we'll talk with you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.